The scent of reclaimed oak and linseed oil was the first thing Henry knew each morning. A perfume more honest and grounding than any of the expensive, cloying fragrances Eleanor sprayed on her wrists before disappearing into the city. His workshop in Red Hook was his sanctuary, a cavern of patient creation carved out of a converted warehouse. Sunlight, thick with dancing motes of sawdust, speared through the tall, grimy windows, illuminating the tools that hung in their designated places with the reverence of religious artifacts. His hands, calloused and mapped with the fine lines of 1,000 tiny cuts, moved with an unconscious grace over the surface of a half-finished rocking chair. This was his language, the silent conversation between man and wood. He could feel the history in the grain, the story of the tree's life, and his work was simply the next chapter. He had downsized his once thriving furniture business to this single-room operation when Leo was born, a decision made jointly with Eleanor, or so he'd thought. He would be the primary caregiver, the stable foundation, while she built her empire in the glass towers of Midtown. He'd embraced the role, finding a profound joy in Leo's small hand in his, in school pickups and scraped knees. But lately, the silence in the workshop felt different. It was heavier, laced with the unspoken tension that now filled their apartment. A silence that smelled not of wood, but of resentment and distance. The rocking chair, a gift for his son's 7th birthday, felt less like a project of love and more like an act of defiance, a way to prove his worth in a world that had begun to measure it in dollars he no longer earned. He ran his thumb over the simple wedding band he wore, a ring he'd carved himself from a piece of oak salvaged from their first tiny apartment, a sliver of silver inlaid in the center. It felt warm against his skin, a constant reminder of a promise that now seemed to belong to a different man, a different lifetime. He didn't know it yet, but the flimsy, forgotten piece of paper sitting on his workbench was about to set that entire lifetime on fire. The lottery ticket was an afterthought, a whim purchased with the change from a gallon of milk 2 days ago. It sat on his workbench, a cheap, colorful rectangle of paper starkly out of place amidst the muted tones of wood shavings and steel tools. He'd almost thrown it out with the coffee grounds that morning, but something, a flicker of what if, made him pause. He picked it up, the paper flimsy and insignificant between his thumb and forefinger. He stared at the numbers, a random sequence he'd let the machine pick, and felt a familiar, foolish pang of hope, the kind a man like him wasn't supposed to indulge in. Eleanor called it his poverty mindset, this belief in luck over ruthless, calculated ambition. For her, success was a skyscraper you clawed your way up, not a lightning bolt from a clear blue sky. He pulled up the Mega Millions website on the dusty laptop perched on a stack of lumber, the Wi-Fi signal struggling to penetrate the thick brick walls. He squinted at the winning numbers on the screen, his heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The first number matched. A coincidence. The second number matched. His breath hitched. The third. A wave of dizziness washed over him, the scent of sawdust suddenly sharp and overwhelming in his nostrils. Fourth. Fifth. He felt the blood drain from his face, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the workbench to steady himself. He was reading it wrong. He had to be. His eyes darted back and forth between the screen and the ticket, the black ink of the numbers seeming to vibrate with an impossible energy. He looked at the final number, the gold megaball. It was a match. His world didn't explode. It simply went silent, the familiar hum of the city outside his window fading into a dull, distant roar. The number on the screen wasn't just a number. It was a figure with a dollar sign and a staggering number of zeros, an amount so vast it felt like a clerical error. It was $50 million, after taxes. A life-altering, world-shattering sum that could solve every problem he and Eleanor ever had, and 1,000 they didn't. Or so he believed in that first, naive, heart-stopping moment. If you enjoy stories of karma, hidden secrets, and the quiet power of the underestimated, subscribe now to witness how the truth always finds a way to surface. The initial shock was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping in the quiet, dusty air of his workshop. $50 million. The phrase was alien, a string of words from a movie or a fantasy novel, not something that belonged in his world of wood glue and sandpaper. He sat down hard on a low stool, the lottery ticket trembling in his hand like a captured moth. His mind, usually so calm and focused on the precise angle of a dovetail joint, was a chaotic storm. He thought of Leo, of a future where his son would never have to worry about the cost of college or the price of a dream. He could have the best of everything, not just the things a father could build with his own two hands. Then, his thoughts turned, as they always did, to Eleanor. The permanent, worried crease between her eyebrows, the way she'd sigh over the credit card bills, her voice tight with a stress that seemed to eat her from the inside out. He saw this money not as his, but as theirs. It was the answer. It was the cure for the poison that had been slowly seeping into their marriage. This jackpot wasn't just money. It was a release valve, a way to finally give her the security she craved, the kind of security his calloused hands and modest income could never provide. He wouldn't have to see the flicker of disappointment in her eyes when he couldn't afford the designer handbag she'd pointed out in a magazine, or the faint, almost imperceptible shame when she introduced him to her colleagues as a furniture restorer. The words carefully chosen to sound more artisanal and less like a man who came home covered in sawdust. This money would change everything. He could buy her a world of platinum and Tiffany's, a world where his simple, handmade oak ring wouldn't look so out of place. A naive, beautiful thought took root in his mind. He would surprise her. He wouldn't just call. He would go to her office, that gleaming glass tower on Park Avenue he'd only ever seen from the outside, and he would lay this new world at her feet. He imagined her face, the disbelief turning to shock, then to a joy so pure it would erase all the bitterness of the past few years. He would finally be enough for her. He would finally be the man she deserved. He grabbed his worn leather jacket, the lottery ticket now safely tucked into the inner pocket, its presence a secret, burning warmth against his chest. He didn't know he was walking into an ambush, armed with nothing but a loving heart and a piece of paper that had already made him a ghost in his own life. The journey from Red Hook to Midtown was a passage between two different worlds, two separate realities that were somehow supposed to coexist in his life. The subway rattled and screeched, its familiar rhythm a strange counterpoint to the frantic, silent symphony playing in his head. He was acutely aware of the people around him, the tired faces, the worn-out shoes, the palpable sense of struggle. Just an hour ago, he was one of them, his worries confined to the cost of lumber and a looming tuition payment for Leo's school. Now, he was a phantom, a secret king riding in a steel carriage, his pockets metaphorically overflowing with a treasure no one could see. The contrast made him feel dizzy, a strange mixture of guilt and exhilaration. He felt the lottery ticket against his ribs, a talisman of a future he couldn't yet comprehend. When he emerged from the station onto Park Avenue, the city's roar hit him with a different intensity. It wasn't the communal industrial hum of Brooklyn. It was the polished, arrogant purr of immense wealth. The buildings weren't made of brick and history, but of glass and steel, designed to reflect the sky and intimidate those on the ground. He felt a familiar knot of inadequacy tighten in his stomach. His work boots, scuffed and stained with wood varnish, felt clumsy and loud on the pristine marble sidewalk. His jeans, clean but softened with age, felt like a costume of poverty in a sea of tailored suits and designer dresses. He was a piece of rough-hewn oak in a gallery of polished chrome. He stood before Eleanor's building, a sheer cliff of dark glass that seemed to disappear into the clouds, and had to crane his neck to see the top. Men and women with sharp cheekbones and sharper briefcases flowed through the revolving doors, their movements efficient and purposeful. They belonged here. He did not. He clutched the straps of his old canvas messenger bag, a nervous habit, and thought of the contents. A half-eaten apple, a sketchbook of furniture designs, and a $50 million secret. He took a deep breath, the air tasting sterile and air-conditioned, and pushed his way through the revolving door. The lobby was a cathedral of corporate power, vast and silent except for the soft clicking of heels on the marble floor. The air smelled of nothing, a deliberately scrubbed clean scent that was somehow more unnerving than any odor. A security guard with an earpiece eyed him with professional suspicion, and Henry knew, with a sinking certainty, that he was trespassing in his wife's real life. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset and an expression of bored indifference, looked him up and down as if he were a particularly uninteresting insect that had wandered in from the street. His name, Henry, seemed to hang in the air for a moment, an unfamiliar rustic sound in this temple of monosyllabic power players. "I'm Eleanor's husband," he added, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the cavernous space. The words felt like a lie, or at least a half-truth. He was the man she went home to, the father of her child. But was he her husband in this world? The receptionist's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, or mild contempt, passed through her eyes before she buzzed him through. The elevator ride was a silent, terrifying ascent. The car was lined with dark, polished wood, but it wasn't the warm, living material he knew. It was lacquered and sealed, its soul trapped beneath a glossy, impenetrable sheen, a perfect metaphor for his marriage. He watched the floor numbers climb at a nauseating speed, his ears popping with the change in pressure. When the doors opened on the 48th floor, the silence was even more profound. The carpets were so thick they swallowed the sound of his footsteps, making him feel like a ghost gliding through a museum. The walls were adorned with abstract art, massive canvases of color and shape that screamed their price tags. Down a long hall he saw it, Eleanor's name on a plaque next to a set of imposing glass doors. Eleanor Vance, Director of Marketing. He felt a swell of pride, quickly followed by a pang of something else, something lonelier. This was her kingdom. He reached for the handle, his surprise ready on his lips. The story of the lottery ticket about to burst from him in a joyous, life-changing torrent. But as his fingers brushed against the cold, brushed steel handle, he heard voices from within, muffled, but clear enough. A man's voice, low and confident, laced with an easy amusement. And then, Eleanor's, her laugh. It wasn't the tired, strained laugh he heard at home. It was a full, throaty, vibrant sound he hadn't heard in years. It was a laugh she saved for someone else. A cold dread, colder than the marble in the lobby, began to seep into his bones, freezing the joyful words in his throat. He froze, his hand hovering just inches from the door handle. The instinct to knock, to reveal himself, warred with a primal sense of danger, a gut-wrenching premonition that he was standing on the edge of a cliff. He shouldn't be listening. It was a violation of her privacy, a betrayal of trust. But the sound of that laugh, so carefree and intimate, held him captive. It was a key turning in a lock he never knew existed, opening a door to a room he wasn't meant to see. He leaned closer, his ear pressed against the cool, unyielding glass of the door. The sound became clearer, the words crystallizing from the muffled murmur. The man was speaking now. The investors are getting nervous about the Red Hook redevelopment. They think it's too risky. Henry's heart gave a painful lurch. Red Hook, his neighborhood, a place Eleanor often described with a dismissive wave of her hand as grimy and provincial. Then he heard her voice, dripping with a confident disdain that was chillingly unfamiliar. "Don't worry about the investors, Marcus. I can handle them." The name, Marcus, landed like a punch. Marcus Thorne, her boss. The charismatic, predatory CEO she spoke of with a mixture of professional reverence and, Henry now realized, something far more personal. "And what about your husband?" Marcus asked, his tone shifting from business to something silky and conspiratorial. "Is he going to be a problem? These divorces can get messy, especially with a child involved." Henry's blood ran cold. Divorce. The word echoed in the silent hallway, a ricocheting bullet in the cathedral of glass and steel. He felt his knees weaken, his hand instinctively going to the inner pocket of his jacket, to the lottery ticket that was supposed to be their salvation. He had come here to save his marriage, only to find out it was already dead and buried. Then came Eleanor's reply, and every word was a shovel of dirt on its grave. "Marcus, I swear, as soon as I get him to sign the divorce papers, this will all be ours. He's too simple to put up a fight." The world tilted, the polished hallway stretching and warping around him, as if he were looking through a distorted lens. He was simple, a problem to be handled, an obstacle to be removed. But the final words were what shattered him, what broke through the shock and drove a shard of ice deep into his heart. The man, Marcus, let out a low, satisfied chuckle, a sound of pure, predatory conquest that made the fine hairs on Henry's arms stand up. It was the sound of a wolf who had already cornered its prey. Henry felt a wave of nausea, the stale air of the hallway suddenly thick and unbreathable. He wanted to run, to flee back to the honest scent of sawdust and the solid reality of his workshop. But his feet were rooted to the plush carpet, held in place by a morbid need to hear the end of his own execution. He needed to hear the final nail being hammered into the coffin of the life he thought he had. He pressed his ear harder against the glass, the cold seeping into his skin, a stark contrast to the fire of shame and rage burning in his chest. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice a low, chilling purr that was more intimate than any touch. It was the voice of a conspirator, a betrayer, a woman he did not know at all. She was sealing his fate, describing him to her lover, reducing 15 years of shared history, of love and struggle and raising a child, into a single, brutal, and utterly devastating metaphor. He braced himself, his entire body tense, waiting for the final, killing blow. He thought of his hands, calloused from building their first bed, from fixing their son's bicycle, from carving the very ring on his finger. He thought of the nights he'd stayed up with a sick Leo, the sacrifices he'd made, the business he'd downsized, all for her, for them. He had believed he was building a foundation, a sturdy, reliable structure of love and support. But he was wrong. To her, he wasn't a foundation. He was just the furniture. He was something to be used until it was no longer fashionable, something to be discarded when a more expensive modern piece came along. He heard her sigh, a sound of faux weariness, of a burden about to be lifted. And then she delivered the line, the one that would echo in his mind for weeks, the one that would become the fuel for the cold, meticulous fire of his revenge. "He's a good puppy," she said, her voice laced with a cruel, dismissive fondness. "But I want a wolf." The words "good puppy" hung in the air, a spectral, venomous cloud. They didn't just sting, they hollowed him out, leaving a raw, gaping void where his pride and self-worth used to be. A puppy, loyal, simple, eager to please, and ultimately, disposable. That's what he was to her. Not a partner, not a husband, not the father of her child, but a pet she had outgrown. The warmth of the $50 million lottery ticket in his pocket turned to ash, its promise of a brighter future now a cruel mockery of his own blindness. He had come here to give her the world, and she had just revealed that he was nothing in hers. He pulled his ear away from the glass, his movements slow and robotic, as if he were moving through deep water. He looked at his own reflection in the polished surface of the door, a distorted, wavering image of a man he no longer recognized. The hopeful, loving husband who had walked into this building 30 minutes ago was gone, replaced by this stranger with haunted eyes and a face pale with shock. He saw the scuffed boots, the worn jeans, the calloused hands, and for the first time, he saw them through her eyes. He saw a relic, a craft project, a good puppy. The rage came next, a white-hot wave that threatened to consume him. He wanted to burst through the door, to confront them, to see the shock and fear on their faces. He wanted to scream, to shatter the smug, sterile silence of this place. He wanted to throw the lottery ticket at her feet and watch her smug superiority crumble into greedy, desperate regret. But another instinct, colder and far more dangerous, took hold. It was the quiet, patient instinct of a craftsman. You don't smash a warped piece of wood. You study its flaws, you understand its weaknesses, and you use precise, deliberate force to reshape it. A screaming match would give them a brief, ugly scene. It would make him look like the simple, emotional fool she believed him to be. It would give her exactly what she wanted, a quick, messy end. No, she didn't deserve a quick end. She and her wolf deserved something far more methodical, something built with the same patience and precision he used to build his furniture. He turned away from the door, his footsteps now utterly silent on the thick carpet. He was a ghost, leaving the scene of his own murder. As he walked back down the long, opulent hallway, the shock and pain began to cool, hardening into a new, unfamiliar resolve. He was no longer a husband coming to save his marriage. He was an architect, and he was about to start drafting the blueprints for their ruin. The descent in the elevator was the opposite of his ride up. He was no longer ascending with a heart full of hope. He was plunging into a cold, dark new reality. The polished wood walls that had seemed so soulless before now felt like the inside of a coffin. He stared at his reflection, but the man looking back was a stranger. The soft, hopeful light in his eyes had been extinguished, replaced by something hard and glacial. The city streets, once a symbol of overwhelming wealth and power, now looked different. The arrogance was still there, but now he saw the cracks. He saw the desperation behind the expensive suits, the fear behind the confident strides. He was an outsider, but for the first time, he didn't feel inferior. He felt separate, untouchable. He had a secret they couldn't possibly comprehend, a weapon they would never see coming. The $50 million was no longer a gift for Eleanor. It was a war chest. He walked for hours, the city a blur of noise and motion around him. He didn't feel the cold wind whipping down the avenues or the jostling of the crowds. He was insulated by a thick blanket of numbness, his mind working with a chilling clarity it had never possessed before. He thought about Leo. The raw, protective fury that surged through him was a physical force, tightening his chest and clenching his fists. This wasn't just about his own broken heart anymore. This was about his son. Eleanor had been willing to discard him, to trade him in for a wolf, but in doing so, she was threatening Leo's stability, his home, his future. She was planning to take all of this, which meant the assets they had built together, meager as they were in her eyes. She saw Leo as a complication in a messy divorce, a pawn to be managed. That was a line she should never have crossed. He found himself standing in front of the East River, looking out at the murky, churning water. The Brooklyn Bridge stood silhouetted against the graying sky, a testament to engineering and endurance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wedding ring. The oak felt strangely light, the inlaid silver catching the dim light. It was a symbol of a shared history he now knew was a lie. It was a craft project, a source of shame, a symbol of the good puppy. With a sudden, decisive movement, he drew his arm back and hurled the ring as far as he could into the river. He watched it disappear into the gray water without a splash. It wasn't an act of anger, it was a declaration. The man who had carved that ring, the man who had believed in its promise, was gone. He had drowned in a glass office on the 48th floor. A new man stood in his place, and he was about to learn just how much a simple carpenter could build when his only materials were righteous anger and $50 million. He returned to the workshop not as a sanctuary, but as a war room. The familiar scent of wood and oil no longer felt comforting. It felt like fuel. The tools hanging on the wall were no longer just for shaping wood. They were instruments of precision, reminders of the meticulous planning that was about to begin. For 2 weeks, he lived a double life with a discipline that would have shocked Eleanor. To her, he was the same old Henry, the quiet, slightly sad husband who was becoming more withdrawn. A man she likely assumed was sensing the inevitable end and was too simple to confront it. He made Leo's breakfast. He walked him to school. He worked on the rocking chair, his movements as steady and predictable as ever. He was the puppy, playing his part, lulling the masters of the house into a false sense of security. But when Leo was asleep and the workshop door was locked, a different Henry emerged. The dusty laptop, once used for checking lumber prices and looking up joinery techniques, became his portal into a world of corporate warfare. He didn't just cash the lottery ticket, he weaponized it. The first call was to a lawyer, not a divorce attorney from a billboard, but the most ruthless financial litigator in New York City. A man known for dismantling corporate empires and finding skeletons in the most pristine of closets. The initial consultation took place over a secure video call, Henry sitting on a sawhorse in his dusty workshop, the lawyer in a penthouse office overlooking Central Park. Henry laid out the facts with a cold, emotionless clarity that made the lawyer, a man who had seen every form of human greed and betrayal, raise an eyebrow. This wasn't a heartbroken husband. This was a client with a clear objective and unlimited resources. The lawyer's name was Arthur Vance, a delicious irony that wasn't lost on Henry. Arthur immediately brought in a team of forensic accountants, specialists in tracing money through the labyrinthine corridors of shell companies and offshore accounts. They began a deep dive into Eleanor's and Marcus Thorne's finances, into their high-end property development firm, Thorne and Associates. Henry learned a new vocabulary, words like NDA, irrevocable deed, and shell company. He discovered that the Red Hook redevelopment project Marcus had mentioned was more than just a business deal. It was a scheme to use insider information to buy up properties from unsuspecting local owners, people like him, at a fraction of their worth, only to flip them for a massive profit once the city approved the new zoning. And Eleanor was at the very heart of it. She wasn't just Marcus's lover, she was his key accomplice. The puppy was learning the wolves' tricks, and he was horrified by the depths of their depravity. The forensic accountants worked with silent, surgical efficiency, and what they unearthed was a cesspool of greed and corruption hidden beneath the polished veneer of Thorne and Associates. Henry would receive encrypted files late at night, sitting in the quiet glow of his laptop screen while the city slept. Each document was a new layer of betrayal, a fresh testament to the woman he had married. He discovered that for the past 2 years, Eleanor had been systematically diverting small, seemingly insignificant sums from their joint savings account into a private one of her own. It wasn't enough to raise alarm bells, just a few $100s here and there, but over time it had amounted to a substantial nest egg, a getaway fund for her new life with Marcus. The discovery felt less like a financial blow and more like a personal violation, the slow, methodical theft of a future he thought they were building together. He found emails, encrypted and intended to be deleted between Eleanor and Marcus. They weren't love letters, they were business plans. They discussed their strategy for the divorce, how to leverage custody of Leo to minimize her alimony payments, how to portray Henry as an unstable, unambitious man, incapable of providing a suitable home, thereby ensuring she got the apartment and primary custody. His simple nature wasn't just a source of her contempt. It was a cornerstone of her legal strategy. But the real prize was what the accountants found buried deep within Thorne and Associates' financials. Marcus Thorne was a charismatic predator, but he was also a reckless one. He had been using a series of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands to launder money, hiding profits from investors and the IRS. And Eleanor, in her climb to the top, had co-signed documents, her digital signature a permanent ghost in the machine, linking her directly to the fraud. She thought she was being made a partner in a glamorous empire, but in reality, Marcus had made her his accomplice, his insurance policy. If he went down, she was going down with him. Henry stared at the damning evidence, a complex web of transactions and offshore accounts, and felt a chilling sense of power. He could destroy them both with a single anonymous tip to the SEC. He could send them to prison, but that felt too easy, too impersonal. It was justice, but it wasn't retribution. He wanted them to see his face when their world came crashing down. He wanted them to know that the puppy they had so casually dismissed was the one holding the leash. And he knew the perfect place to pull it tight. The annual Horizon Gala at the Plaza Hotel, the company's biggest event of the year, was in 1 week. It was the night Marcus was planning to announce Eleanor's promotion to Vice President of Acquisitions. It would be her coronation, the public validation of everything she had schemed and betrayed to achieve. It was perfect. A stage was already being built for her triumph, and he would be the one to turn it into a scaffold. The week leading up to the gala was a masterclass in deception. Henry moved through his days with an unnerving calm, a man walking the tightrope between two vastly different identities. In the mornings, he was Dad, the patient carpenter who quizzed Leo on his spelling words and packed his lunch, a juice box and a sandwich cut into the shape of a dinosaur. He listened as Leo chattered excitedly about school, his innocent joy a stark, painful contrast to the darkness coiling in Henry's own gut. He would meet Eleanor at the door in the evenings, taking her briefcase, her expression a familiar mask of exhaustion and impatience. She barely looked at him, her mind already on the next day's conquests. He was part of the furniture, a fixture in the life she was already mentally vacating. He'd ask about her day, and she would give him clipped, edited answers, never mentioning the name Marcus, never hinting at the promotion she knew was coming. The lies were so easy for her, so natural. He played his part perfectly, the supportive, slightly clueless husband. He even feigned a mild jealousy about the gala. "Sounds fancy," he'd say, sanding a piece of maple at his workbench. "Guess it's not really a place for a guy like me." Eleanor would offer a tight, patronizing smile. "It's just a boring work thing, honey. You'd hate it." The condescension, which once would have stung, now felt like a sharpening stone, honing the edge of his resolve. Meanwhile, the other Henry, the secret millionaire, was making his own preparations. He didn't just buy a tuxedo. He had one custom made by Tom Ford's personal tailor, a man who typically only dressed royalty and billionaires. The fitting took place in a private, discreet studio in Soho. As the tailor measured him, his hands moving with practiced expertise, Henry saw his reflection in the three-way mirror. The man emerging from the rough-hewn carpenter was someone he'd never seen before. The perfectly cut lines of the suit straightened his posture, broadened his shoulders, and gave him an air of quiet, formidable authority. He looked like he belonged on Park Avenue. He looked like he could own it. He also made another, more crucial arrangement. Through his lawyer, he made a substantial anonymous donation to one of the charities the Horizon Gala was supporting, enough to make him a primary corporate sponsor. The donation came with a single, non-negotiable condition. As a new sponsor, his representative would be given 5 minutes on stage to say a few words. The gala organizers, blinded by the size of the check, readily agreed. Everything was falling into place, each piece as perfectly joined as the corners of a custom cabinet. The stage was set, the audience was gathering, and the star of the show had no idea she was about to be in a tragedy of her own making. The night of the gala arrived, a crisp, clear evening in New York City. The air crackled with the energy of wealth and anticipation. Henry dropped Leo off at a trusted friend's house, giving his son an extra long hug, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and promising to bring him back a fancy dessert. The embrace lingered, a silent promise to protect his son from the fallout of the storm he was about to unleash. As he drove towards Manhattan, he was acutely aware of the transformation he had undergone. He wasn't just wearing a different suit, he was wearing a different skin. The Tom Ford tuxedo felt less like a costume and more like armor, the silk and wool a protective layer over the raw. The apartment was always cold in the morning. a deliberate architectural coldness that had nothing to do with the season outside. It was the chill of polished concrete floors, of vast, unadorned white walls, and of glass that stretched from floor to ceiling, framing a view of the Manhattan skyline that Eleanor called an asset, and Henry saw as a constant, accusing reminder of a world he didn't belong to. He rose first, his bare feet padding silently on the cold surface, a stark contrast to the plush, sound-dampening carpets of their old life in Brooklyn. This space, their home for the past 3 years, felt less like a home and more like a gallery curated by his wife, a minimalist exhibition of her success, in which he was the single, out-of-place exhibit. Her side of the king-sized bed was an undisturbed landscape of high thread-count Egyptian cotton. His side held the faint indentation of his body, a temporary flaw in the room's perfection. He moved to the closet, a walk-in space larger than his first workshop. Her clothes hung with military precision, a monochrome army of tailored blazers, silk blouses, and designer dresses, each piece a testament to her ascent. His own clothes were relegated to a small corner, a humble collection of flannel shirts, worn denim, and a single, heavy wool coat that had been his father's. He reached for it, the rough texture a familiar comfort against his fingertips. It smelled faintly of sawdust, linseed oil, and old wool, the honest perfume of his life. He could feel her disdain for it even when she wasn't in the room, a palpable wave of disapproval that seemed to emanate from the cashmere and leather surrounding it. He was a splinter of rough-hewn oak in her polished world of chrome and glass, and every morning began with the quiet, crushing weight of that knowledge. He was in the kitchen, the heart of the home that had no warmth, when Eleanor emerged from the bedroom. She was already half transformed into the woman who commanded boardrooms, her hair pulled back in a severe, elegant knot, her face a mask of expensive moisturizers. The scent of her perfume, something sharp and citrusy that smelled like money, cut through the simple aroma of the coffee he was brewing. He was packing Leo's lunch, carefully placing a sandwich into a worn, canvas backpack that had been his own in college. The fabric was faded to a soft olive green, a small leather patch on the front worn smooth with time, and a zipper that always caught unless you knew its specific trick. It was a good bag, reliable and strong, filled with the ghosts of his own youthful ambitions. Eleanor stopped, her perfectly sculpted eyebrow arching in a familiar expression of weary contempt. "Henry, are you really still using that thing?" she asked, her voice devoid of any real curiosity, the question a judgment in itself. "It's for Leo's field trip," he said, his voice quiet, his eyes focused on the task at hand. "It's sturdy." She let out a short, humorless laugh, a sound like ice cracking. "It's an embarrassment," she corrected him, her tone sharp and final. "It looks like something you'd find in a dumpster. He's going to a private school, not a logging camp. My God, what will the other mothers think?" The shame was a physical sensation, a hot flush that crawled up his neck. He wanted to tell her that the other mothers barely registered her existence, that they were too busy with their own lives to inspect his son's backpack. He wanted to tell her that the bag had history, that it was a part of him, a part of the man she had once claimed to love. But he said nothing. He simply continued to pack the lunch, his movements becoming more deliberate, more controlled, as if to contain the tremor of anger and hurt that was running through him. He was a relic, a piece of her past she was forced to look at every morning, and she never missed an opportunity to remind him of his obsolescence. If you enjoy stories of karma, hidden secrets, and the quiet power of the underestimated, subscribe now to witness how the truth always finds a way to surface. Eleanor glided over to the espresso machine, a sleek, stainless steel monolith that had cost more than all of his power tools combined. She operated it with an impatient, practiced efficiency, the machine hissing and sputtering to life under her command. As she waited, her gaze fell on his wrist, resting on the white marble countertop. He wore a simple, steel-cased watch with a worn leather strap, a gift from his father on his 18th birthday. It was reliable, it told the time, and it held the memory of his father's proud, calloused hand clasping his own. "Marcus was showing me his new Patek Philippe yesterday," she said, her voice casual, but the comparison was a dagger. "It's incredible, a true investment piece. It says something about a man, the watch he wears." Henry didn't look up from the lunchbox. He knew what she was implying. His watch said he was stagnant, a man out of time. Her world was one of investment pieces and status symbols. His was one of sentiment and function. The gulf between them had become an impassable canyon. "This one works just fine," he mumbled, the defense sounding weak even to his own ears. She sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of frustration. That's not the point, Henry. And you know it. It's about perception. It's about showing the world you've arrived. The tuition for Leo's school, the mortgage on this apartment, the life we have. It doesn't just happen. It's built on perception. Her words were a carefully constructed narrative in which he was the sole liability. She conveniently forgot that he was the one who had sacrificed his business's expansion to be the full-time parent, allowing her the freedom to work 80-hour weeks. He was the one who cooked, cleaned, and managed the household, an unpaid, invisible labor that made her high-powered career possible. But in her ledger, his contributions were worthless because they didn't come with a price tag from Tiffany's. He could feel the cheap leather of his watch band against his skin, suddenly feeling like a shackle, a symbol of the life she believed he had trapped her in. The tension in the kitchen was a thick, suffocating fog, but it dissipated in an instant when a small figure bounded into the room. Leo, all boundless 7-year-old energy, was a splash of vibrant color in the sterile white space. He ran straight to Henry, wrapping his arms around his legs in a fierce hug. "Pancakes?" he asked, his voice muffled against Henry's jeans. Henry's heart unclenched, the anger and shame momentarily forgotten. He smiled, a genuine, unforced expression that felt alien in this room. "Dinosaur-shaped pancakes," he confirmed, ruffling his son's messy hair. For these few moments, he wasn't a failure or a relic. He was just Dad. He was the center of this small boy's universe, and it was the only title that had ever truly mattered to him. He swung Leo up onto a bar stool, the sound of his son's happy chatter filling the silence. Eleanor watched the scene from a distance, a small, tight smile on her face that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of a visiting dignitary, a polite but detached acknowledgement of a local custom she didn't quite understand. She leaned in to kiss the top of Leo's head, her movements quick and precise, a checklist item completed. "Be good for your father, sweetie. Mommy has a very important day." Her affection was a performance, a brief scene she played before exiting stage left. Henry saw the fleeting look of disappointment in Leo's eyes as she turned away, a look he had become an expert at soothing. He plastered a cheerful grin on his face, turning his attention to the pancake batter, pouring it onto the griddle with a practiced hand. He was the buffer, the shock absorber, the man who stood between his son's innocent heart and his mother's cold ambition. He absorbed her daily contempt so that Leo wouldn't have to, swallowing the poison so that his son could have a sweet, normal morning. He wondered, with a sudden, chilling clarity, how much more poison he could take before it started to seep through. The ritual of her departure was the final act of the morning's play. She stood by the door, transformed. The soft robe had been replaced by a sharply tailored suit, her feet encased in heels that clicked against the concrete floor like tiny, menacing hammers. She held a leather briefcase that was worth more than his monthly income, her armor for the corporate battlefield. Henry stood by the counter, holding Leo's hand, the two of them a silent, domestic audience to her grand exit. She did a final check in the mirror by the door, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from her blazer. Her eyes flickered down, catching the light on his left hand. He saw the almost imperceptible curl of her lip. She was looking at his wedding ring, the simple band of oak and silver he had carved for himself, a matching one to the one she kept hidden in her jewelry box, replaced by a massive, cold diamond. To him, the ring was a circle of their history, a piece of their first home, a symbol of a promise. To her, it was a craft project, a public humiliation, a wooden testament to the humble man she was trying so desperately to erase from her life story. "Try to tidy up today," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room, but her focus was on him. The place looked so cluttered. The word hung in the air, a final, perfectly aimed insult. He wasn't just a man, he and everything he represented were clutter in her pristine, upwardly mobile life. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind her, the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place echoing in the sudden, vast silence. He was alone with his son in a multi-million-dollar apartment that felt like a cage, looking down at the hands that had built a life she was now systematically tearing apart. In that moment, he felt a profound and terrifying sense of erasure, the chilling realization that in her eyes, he was already gone. The finality of the deadbolt sliding into place was no longer just a sound, it was a punctuation mark on his erasure. For 3 days, Henry moved through the cold, silent apartment like a ghost, a specter of the husband he had once been. He played his part with an Oscar-worthy performance of defeated normalcy, He made Leo's dinosaur-shaped pancakes, the familiar, comforting scent of batter on the griddle, a stark contrast to the acid churning in his stomach. He walked his son to school, his hand holding Leo's tightly, a desperate physical anchor in a world that had come unmoored. He answered Eleanor's perfunctory evening texts with monosyllabic replies. He was the good puppy, housebroken and silent, lulling her into a state of supreme, arrogant confidence. But beneath the placid surface, a tectonic shift was occurring. The grief was hardening into something cold and sharp. The pain was crystallizing into pure, unadulterated resolve. The trigger wasn't a single event, but the slow, agonizing realization that her cruelty was not a recent development, but a fundamental part of her character he had simply refused to see. The final snap came on a Wednesday night. She came home late, humming a tune he didn't recognize, her face flushed with the kind of triumphant energy she only ever brought back from the office. She tossed her keys into a ceramic bowl on the console table, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet apartment. "Had a great meeting with the planners for the Red Hook project," she announced to the room, not specifically to him. "We're going to completely transform that grimy little corner of the world." The casual, dismissive way she spoke about his home, his sanctuary, the place where he had built his life and his father had built his before him, was the final, careless spark on a mountain of dry tinder. In her eyes, his entire existence was just a grimy corner of the world, waiting to be bulldozed and replaced by something shiny and new. The patience he had been cultivating, the slow burn plan for a public humiliation, suddenly felt too distant, too abstract. He needed to know everything. He needed to see the full scope of her treachery, to hold the proof in his hands. He needed to break into her world, just as she was planning to break his. The decision settled over him not with a crash, but with a chilling, profound calm. Tonight, he would stop being a ghost in his own home and become a thief. Later that night, the apartment was a tomb of glass and concrete, washed in the indifferent glow of the city. Eleanor slept with deep, even breaths, the serene rhythm of a person with no conscience. Henry stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the rise and fall of her chest. She looked like a stranger now, a beautifully sculpted marble effigy of the woman he thought he knew. Whatever love had once lived in him was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical curiosity, the focused attention of a demolition expert, studying a building's weak points before planting charges. His target waited in her closet, the briefcase, a rigid black rectangle perched on a custom valet stand like an altar. He moved with a silence he didn't know he possessed, bare feet soundless on polished concrete. Every sense felt sharpened to pain. The HVAC's low hum sounded enormous. A siren 30 stories below seemed close enough to touch. He could feel cold air sliding over his skin, and he could smell the faint residue of her perfume. Once alluring, now unmistakably the scent of deceit. The briefcase had a 3-dial combination lock. His heart hammered, frantic and trapped. He was a carpenter. His hands were made for honest grain and predictable cuts, not the cold mechanics of a lock. His mind raced. What would she choose? Her arrogance was always her weakness, something personal, something that fed her ego. Not her birthday, not Leo's. He thought of her first major deal, the one that launched her into the executive ranks. 712 Park Avenue. Holding his breath, lungs burning, he dialed it, 712, and tugged the latch. Nothing. Panic surged, icy and humiliating. He was wrong. He was a fool. He was about to be caught, pathetic, snooping through his wife's things. Then he remembered how she always rounded up, always wanted bigger, better. He tried again, hands slick with sweat. The fictional penthouse number she joked was her destiny, 400. The latch gave with a soft metallic click that sounded, in the silence, as loud as a gunshot. He carried the briefcase into the living room, the vast open space suddenly feeling like an exposed stage. The skyline stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a billion indifferent lights bearing witness. He set the case on the glass coffee table. The contact made a soft, solid thud. For a suspended moment he only stared at it, Pandora's box in Italian leather and steel, knowing that opening it was a step across a line he could never uncross. Then he lifted the lid. Everything inside was arranged with ruthless efficiency. A sleek silver laptop in a custom slot, a black moleskin notebook held tight by an elastic band, an expensive fountain pen, and a slim black external hard drive. No clutter, No personal softness, only tools. He reached for the notebook first, the analog heart of whatever she'd been building. Any guilt he expected was absent, burned away by the memory of her calling his neighborhood grimy. The pages whispered as he opened them. Her handwriting was sharp and angular, like glass. On the first page, a heading froze the air in his lungs. Divorce Strategy, Phase 1. His eyes moved over bullet points that read like a hostile takeover plan. Asset allocation. The apartment flagged for secure via irrevocable deed, her investment accounts, and a line that made his stomach turn. Joint savings, drain prior to filing. Then, liability management, with a single item beneath it. Henry. His name, reduced to a risk to be mitigated. Notes beside it struck like fists. Leverage his emotional attachment to Leo. Emphasize lack of income potential. Portray the workshop as unsafe. She wasn't just leaving him. She was planning to erase him as a father. He flipped further, scanning for the one name he dreaded and expected. Marcus. It was everywhere, threaded through pages of meetings that read as strategy sessions with a private undercurrent. Red Hook redevelopment maps, projected profit margins, and then a line scrawled beside a block of properties that included his own workshop. H will be emotional. Use it. They weren't only taking assets, they were planning to weaponize his history, his love, his identity. By the time he closed the notebook, his hands had stopped trembling. Shock gave way to a glacial calm, the focused precision of a man disarming a bomb. He ignored the company laptop. His intuition said the real rot wouldn't be on anything monitored by corporate IT. He reached for the anonymous black hard drive instead. It was small, cool, and unnervingly dense in his palm, as if it carried its secrets by weight alone. He retrieved his own laptop from the corner he'd carved out of her immaculate world. Old, scuffed, almost embarrassing beside the sleek furniture. The irony tasted bitter. He would use his obsolete past to dismantle her curated future. He plugged the drive in and waited for a password wall. None came. Careless. Arrogant. A folder appeared, innocently labeled personal. He clicked. Inside was a labyrinth. Financial statements from a bank he'd never heard of. Offshore. Shielded. Showing balances that made his breath catch. Money siphoned from their life for years. Scanned legal documents. The draft of an irrevocable deed for their apartment. Ready to be slipped into a stack of papers for him to sign at the right moment. He felt something chilling and unwilling in his chest. Admiration for the meticulous cruelty of it. She had been building an escape hatch while he was building their son's rocking chair. Then he saw the folder titled Trips. He clicked, and his world ended a second time. It wasn't one picture. It was a timeline. Dozens of photographs organized by date and place. St. Bart's. Eleanor laughing on a yacht, head thrown back in joy he hadn't seen in years, her hand on Marcus's bare chest. Aspen. Expensive ski gear, a kiss in bright snow, mountains behind them like jagged witnesses. Lake Como. Golden cafe light, wine glasses touching, eyes locked in shared intimacy and conspiracy. Each image was a fresh stab. He saw the gifts too, a Cartier watch, a diamond necklace, luxury purchased not just with money, but with lies that mocked everything simple he'd given her. The pain was so physical, he had to brace himself against the coffee table, knuckles whitening. The good puppy thought returned, darker now. He hadn't just been left behind. He had been the loyal animal guarding the house while the wolves ate inside. And then, something else slid into place. Not forgiveness, not collapse, purpose. He pulled an encrypted thumb drive from his bag, the kind he used to back up furniture designs, and began copying everything. Every financial statement, every legal draft, every email, every damning photograph. He worked silently, methodically, the cold blue screen light turning his face into a mask. This wasn't snooping anymore. It was excavation. He wasn't just collecting evidence. He was reclaiming his history, piece by stolen, deceitful piece. When the first gray hint of dawn streaked over the East River, he knew he had what he needed, not merely to survive a divorce, but to dismantle the world they'd built, down to its foundation. He clicked it open, and his world, already cracked and fractured, finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. It wasn't one picture. It was a comprehensive visual timeline of the life she'd been living behind his back. A vibrant, full-color world from which he'd been completely excluded. Meticulously organized by date and location, like an archive of betrayal. St. Bart's. Summer 2021. Eleanor on the deck of a gleaming white yacht, turquoise water behind her, laughing with a genuine, uninhibited joy he hadn't seen aimed at him in years. Her hand resting possessively on Marcus Thorne's tanned, shirtless chest. Marcus smiled down at her with smug ownership. Aspen, winter, 2022. The two of them in expensive, brightly colored ski gear, kissing in the snow, the jagged peaks behind them like silent witnesses. Lake Como, last spring. A candid shot at an outdoor cafe, light golden and romantic, wine glasses touching in a toast, eyes locked in shared intimacy and conspiracy. He scrolled, each image a fresh stab, each click of the trackpad, another turn of the knife. He saw the expensive gifts, a Cartier watch on her wrist he'd never seen, a diamond necklace he could never afford, mocking the simple wooden ring he'd carved for her with pride. He saw the woman he loved, or thought he loved, looking happier, more vibrant, more alive with another man than she had ever looked with him. The pain was so immense, so physical, he had to brace himself against the cold glass of the coffee table, knuckles whitening. The good puppy metaphor echoed in his head with a new, sinister meaning. He wasn't just a pet she was leaving behind. He was the loyal, oblivious animal who had guarded the house while the real wolves feasted inside. He stared at the glowing screen, at his wife smiling in another man's arms, and grief, mercifully, began to burn away, leaving something else in its place. He pulled a blank thumb drive from his worn messenger bag and, with the cold precision of a surgeon preparing for a brutal operation, began the autopsy. The transformation was absolute. The heartbroken husband was gone, incinerated in the laptop's glow. In his place sat a man forged in the cold fire of betrayal, with a singular, crystalline purpose. The tears he expected never came. His emotions had been cauterized into scar tissue and resolve. He moved with feverish efficiency, precise, economical. This wasn't an invasion of privacy anymore. It was an excavation of evidence, a meticulous gathering of artifacts that would build her ruin. He wasn't searching for proof. He was assembling an arsenal. He copied the entire hard drive onto his encrypted thumb drive. The laptop fan's soft whir was the only sound, a low hum vibrating with his newfound dangerous energy. He watched the green progress bar crawl across the screen, each megabyte a bullet being loaded. Financial statements, legal documents, damning photographs, each one another nail for the coffin he was building. His face, washed in cold blue light, became a mask of grim determination. He was no longer a victim discovering tragedy. He was a prosecutor building an airtight case, an architect drafting demolition blueprints. As gray dawn streaked the sky over the East River, purple and steel bleeding into the night, the transfer completed. He ejected the drive and held the small black rectangle in his palm. It felt impossibly heavy, dense with the complete annihilation of Eleanor Vance and Marcus Thorne. He had come looking for the truth about the end of his marriage. He had found something far more valuable: leverage, narrative control, and the power to ensure that when their world collapsed, he would be the one holding the detonator. He slid the external hard drive back into its precise indentation in the briefcase, its smooth surface now like cooled lava, a solid remnant of the eruption that had consumed his life. His movements were deliberate, chillingly efficient. The trembling man who'd fumbled with the combination hours earlier was gone, replaced by steady hands and a cold heart. He closed the lid, the latches clicking shut with metallic finality, and wiped the leather clean with his sleeve, erasing any trace of warmth from his fingertips. In the silent bedroom, city lights cast long, distorted stripes across the cold concrete floor. Eleanor slept on, serene, an innocent portrait. The sight stirred nothing in him now. It was like looking at a beautifully rendered drawing of a condemned building, foundations rotten to the core. He set the briefcase on its valet stand, aligning it perfectly with the dust outline, a ghost returning to its haunt. Then he left. Door pulled closed without a sound. He didn't take the old canvas messenger bag that smelled of wood shavings and home. He took only his keys, his wallet, and the encrypted thumb drive, heavier and more potent than any tool he'd ever owned. The deadbolt whispered open, steel on steel, a quiet reversal of the sound that had so often signaled his imprisonment. He stepped into the hallway. The heavy door sighed shut behind him, and he didn't look back. He was walking out, not as a husband leaving for the day, but as a general leaving his command tent, battle plans etched irrevocably onto his soul. Manhattan before dawn was sharp and cold, a sterile shock that felt cleansing. It smelled of street-cleaned asphalt and exhaust. A gritty honesty after the suffocating, artificial fragrance of his apartment. He walked for miles as the city stirred, the thumb drive in his pocket, a hard promise against his thigh. He wasn't wandering. He was putting distance between the man he'd been and the man he was becoming. He ducked into a bodega and paid cash for a cheap burner phone, the kind meant for conversations you never want traced. On a street corner, he activated it, plastic cool and anonymous in his hand. Then he walked to the river, to the spot where he'd hurled his wedding ring into churning gray water. That act had been despair. What came next was war. He called his lawyer, not a subway ad family attorney, but the most feared financial litigator in the city, Arthur Vance, a name spoken in hushed tones in boardrooms of dismantled companies. Henry had found him through weeks of quiet research during lunch breaks, a contingency plan for a battle he never believed he'd have to fight. The answering service routed him to a private line. A voice, smooth as polished granite, sharp as a razor, answered. Henry didn't introduce himself as a heartbroken husband. He spoke with the cold clarity of a client, with an objective. "My name is Henry," he said, voice stripped of emotion. "I am the sole winner of last week's $50 million Mega Millions jackpot. I have irrefutable evidence that my wife and her business partner are engaged in a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme using offshore shell companies, and that she has been planning to fraudulently secure all of our joint assets in a divorce. I need to protect my son, and then I need to dismantle them." Silence. Pure professional calculation. Then the predator's tone. The first move wasn't defense, but a financial decapitation strike before the banks even opened. By 9 a.m., Henry wasn't in his workshop. He sat in a quiet, opulent meeting room atop a discreet private bank in the financial district, a place with no sign, just a polished brass number on limestone. Arthur Vance arranged it with a single call. The air smelled of old money, lemon oil on mahogany, and the papery scent of century-old trusts. Henry sat at a mirror-polished table, work-worn jeans and a simple flannel shirt, an island of authenticity in a sea of bespoke suits. And for the first time, he felt no inadequacy. He wasn't there to be judged. He was there to give orders. Across from him sat Mr. Sterling, the senior trust manager, posture as straight as the columns outside. Vance appeared via secure video, focused and severe. Henry laid out instructions with the calm precision of a craftsman specifying a complex build. The bulk of the winnings would go into an irrevocable trust for his son, Leo. Legal fortification so impenetrable that no court, creditor, or future ex-wife could touch a dime. Trustees, payout conditions, education provisions, life event clauses. He was building a fortress of legal language and financial instruments, the most important thing he'd ever built. He authorized a separate, smaller account, a war chest under his sole control, and ordered the bank's forensic accounting division placed at Vance's disposal. Mr. Sterling's pen scratched quietly on heavy bond paper, expression unreadable. But when Henry finished, the old banker looked up and something flickered. Respect, perhaps, in cool gray eyes. He wasn't looking at a simple carpenter anymore. He was looking at a man moving millions with quiet authority. With Leo secured behind an impenetrable wall, it was time to stop building defenses and start digging a trap. One so deep and perfectly camouflaged that Eleanor and her lover would walk into it smiling. The next 2 weeks became a masterclass in psychological warfare conducted from the quiet of his workshop. While Eleanor moved with the confidence of a predator certain her prey was oblivious, Henry orchestrated her demise. The workshop became his war room. The thumb drive, duplicated and hidden in secure locations, was ammunition. Daily, he met Vance's team in a sterile, soundproof room downtown that felt more like a black site than a law office. Forensic accountants, quiet, intense people who saw the world as interconnected spreadsheets, cross-referenced hard drive data with public records and filings. On a massive screen, they revealed a damning web. Money traced from Thorne and Associates through Cayman shell companies and back into private accounts. Fraud extensive enough to cheat investors and the IRS out of millions. Signed NDAs silencing former employees, and the draft irrevocable deed for the apartment. Breathtaking, Vance said, in its sheer, unadulterated greed. Vance outlined options. SEC, district attorney, slam dunk, prison time. Henry shook his head. "That's too easy," he said, voice low, cold. "It's clean. It's impersonal. They hide behind lawyers and disappear into a system. I want them to see it happen. I want them at the pinnacle. and I want them to see my face as I'm the one who pushes them off. He named the stage, the Horizon Gala, for promotion, public theater for private execution. A slow smile spread across Vance's face. He expected a victim seeking justice. He found a strategist demanding retribution. The tripwires were set, leading to the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom. One final piece remained. Henry had to transform himself into the version of a man who could walk onto that stage and burn their world down without flinching. The metamorphosis began in the very world Eleanor craved. An appointment-only atelier in a Soho loft run by a legendary tailor who dressed presidents and kings. Henry arrived in carpenter's clothes and asked for one thing. I need a tuxedo. For the plaza, and it needs to be perfect. The tailor, small, elderly, Italian, eyes that had seen everything, nodded. The process was intimate, exacting. Measuring tapes pulled, chalk lines pinned, posture assessed. Henry felt deconstructed and rebuilt from the outside in. Before a triptych of mirrors, the rough-hewn man disappeared, replaced by a stranger. The perfectly cut lines of the Tom Ford tuxedo broadened his shoulders, straightened his spine, and chiseled away the accommodating softness he'd worn for years. It wasn't clothing, it was armor, black silk and wool concealing a raging fire. He learned a new stillness, a new way of standing, of meeting his own gaze without looking away. He was no longer Henry the craftsman, the good puppy. He was Mr. Vance, the anonymous corporate sponsor of the Horizon Gala, secured by a 7-figure donation from a newly created trust. He practiced the calm, confident stride of a man who belonged anywhere. He rehearsed his lines in the noisy chaos of his workshop, his quiet, firm voice cutting through the whine of the table saw. He was sanding down the last vestiges of who he'd been, smoothing edges, preparing a flawless finish. In the mirror, he saw not a carpenter playing a part, but the living embodiment of a consequence they never thought to calculate. A wolf, in a puppy's clothing, ready for the hunt. The attack came not with a shout, but with the quiet rustle of expensive paper. Tuesday evening, 3 days before the gala, Eleanor came home early, rare enough to feel like an omen. She didn't drop her keys or shed her blazer. She walked in with the stiff gait of an executioner and set her leather briefcase on the glass coffee table with a soft, definitive thud. Henry sat on the floor with Leo, helping him assemble a complex Lego build, a small island of warmth in their sterile, minimalist living room. Henry looked up, a question dying on his lips as he saw her face. Cool, practiced pity, the kind a doctor wears before delivering a terminal diagnosis. From the briefcase, she produced a thick manila folder tied with a blue legal ribbon and laid it between them like a silent indictment. "Henry," she began, voice modulated into sorrowful resolve. "We need to talk. This isn't working anymore." Cold prickles ran through him as blood drained from his face. He'd rehearsed this moment, but the reality still landed like a physical blow. He glanced at the folder, then at Leo's wide, confused eyes. On top sat the irrevocable deed, language identical to what he'd copied from her hard drive. It was the blueprint of his destruction, and he had to pretend he was seeing it for the first time. She delivered a masterpiece of corporate spin. Divergent paths, fundamental incompatibilities, 15 years reduced to a failed merger. She framed divorce as kindness, freeing him from a world he was never truly comfortable in. Henry listened with a mask of stunned disbelief, while an icy part of his mind cross-referenced every word with her moleskin notes. When she slid a gleaming black Montblanc pen across the table, gold nib catching the light, he remembered the line. "He's too simple to put up a fight." "I've had my lawyer draw these up to be as fair as possible," she lied, voice dripping with magnanimity. The apartment, she said, should stay for Leo. The deed was just a formality to protect the asset, no alimony. She'd cover Leo's expenses. Every sentence was a lie wrapped in silk, a legal garrote disguised as generosity. Leo's small hand slipped into Henry's. Henry squeezed gently, the only real warmth in the room. He let his shoulders slump. A tremor entered his hand as he reached for the pen. He had to perform perfectly, to embody the broken man she expected. Because everything, his plan, his son's future, the cold satisfaction of justice, depended on her believing she was winning. The pen felt heavy and alien in his calloused hand. He uncapped it with a soft click that echoed in the cavernous silence. Eleanor watched with predatory focus, pity slipping to reveal raw ambition. She thought she was watching him sign away his life. He knew he was signing her confession. He drew the papers closer, thick bond paper slick under his fingertips. and scanned clauses Vance had already flagged. Waivers, predatory custody terms. The deed meant to make her sole owner of their $4 million apartment. Her impatience radiated across the table. She wanted victory finalized. Henry looked up, eyes filling with carefully crafted defeat. "Is this really what you want?" he asked, a wounded whisper. "It's what's best for everyone," she replied, condescending finality in her tone. Henry inhaled, a perfect imitation of collapse, and lowered the pen to the first signature line. Ink flowed, black and permanent. He signed every document, slow and steady, each signature not surrender but rope, tightening a noose, feeding her the line, letting her build her own gallows. He slid the stack back toward her. In his soul, it landed like a silent thunderclap. She gathered the papers with proprietary speed, fingers almost caressing the pages that sealed her triumph. A flicker of relief touched her lips before she restored solemnity. The performance ended, the transaction complete. Now came the eviction. "Henry," she said, sympathy stripped away. "It would be best if you didn't stay tonight. It will only confuse Leo. A clean break is the kindest way." He'd expected it, but the speed was still brutal. He nodded like a condemned man. He didn't look at Leo's crumpled face. The pain he was allowing, temporarily, was unbearable even in service of justice. In the bedroom, he passed her closet. Designer suits and shoes like a monochrome army. He went to his corner and ignored the clothes she'd bought to mold him. He took his father's old wool coat, familiar weight, real comfort, and his faded canvas messenger bag. Inside, a sketchbook, pencils, and the burner phone used to talk to his legal team. He was leaving with the symbols of the man she believed she'd defeated. In the doorway she looked powerful, queen of the kingdom she'd just conquered. Henry let a single genuine tear fall, not for her, but for his son. It was the final confirmation she needed. The heavy apartment door closed behind him. The deadbolt slammed home with a definitive thud, the sweetest sound he'd ever heard, his cage opening, and hers closing forever. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel felt gilded, thick with hothouse flowers and the suffocating aroma of self-congratulation. Laughter was brittle as champagne flutes, every smile a negotiation. Henry stood in the shadows at the back, a ghost in a Tom Ford tuxedo. The suit wasn't fabric, it was an exoskeleton of power, holding him straight and masking the quiet fury thrumming beneath his skin. On stage, Marcus Thorne boomed with easy, unearned confidence, a wolf basking in adoration. Then he announced her name. A spotlight found Eleanor. She rose in emerald silk, smiled dazzling with triumph, queen ascending to her throne. Applause washed over her, and she drank it in. This was the pinnacle she'd killed for. The MC stepped forward. "Before we hear from our new vice president," he said, "we have surprise words from a new, very generous corporate sponsor who wishes to remain anonymous, but whose representative is here to speak." 1,000 eyes turned as the spotlight began to sweep toward the back of the room. Henry knew that in the next 10 seconds, the world Eleanor built would be reduced to smoking rubble. He stepped into the beam, calm and deliberate, shoes silent on the plush, blood-red carpet. He walked down the aisle like an inexorable force, watching Eleanor's mask crumble. Confusion first, a furrowed brow, then shocked recognition. Her smile tightened. By the steps, recognition curdled into horror. Blood drained from her face, leaving waxy white against green silk. She looked to Marcus, whose smirk froze into disbelief. Henry took the microphone, metal cool and solid in his palm. The ballroom fell into hushed, expectant silence. He met Eleanor's eyes and let the silence stretch. Torture by restraint. "Eleanor," he said softly, voice carrying to every corner, "always taught me the importance of a solid foundation." Behind him, the massive screen flickered from Thorne & Associates' logo to a crystal-clear, date-stamped photograph. Eleanor and Marcus kissing on a sun-drenched balcony, her expression pure bliss. A collective gasp swept the room. "She also taught me," Henry continued, voice level as marble, "about the value of upgrading." He reached into his tuxedo jacket, slow and theatrical. "So I upgraded, from a toxic marriage to my freedom. And from this lottery ticket," he raised an oversized Mega Millions check, the kind used at press conferences. The number printed in bold ink was staggering, $50 million. The check was a secondary explosion that dwarfed the first. An affair was gossip. 50 million was seismic. The ballroom filled with frantic whispers, power shifting in real time. Eleanor's mind broke in her eyes, darting between his face, the photograph, the number. Her world wasn't collapsing. It was being vaporized. Her mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging. A choked sob escaped. Her knees buckled. Marcus grabbed her arm, pale and sweating, trying to keep her upright. Henry lowered the microphone. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't begged. He had simply presented facts, building his case with the same cold precision he used to build a cabinet. As he turned, two quiet men in conservative suits and a woman with a leather portfolio entered from a side door, eyes fixed not on the stage, but on Marcus Thorne, SEC, Vance's final, perfectly timed move. Henry walked back down the aisle as the stunned crowd parted for him like he was a king. He didn't look back at the wreckage. He had built his son a fortress and his enemies a coffin, and for the first time in years, he was finally free to build something for himself. 6 months later, the air tasted different. No metallic tang of the city, no sterile, recycled chill of Park Avenue. In a quiet valley in the Hudson Highlands, the air was thick with pine after rain, damp earth, and the sweet perfume of cut cedar from Henry's new workshop. The workshop was a cathedral he designed, a timber-framed barn with a wall of windows, sunlight spilling over restored antiques and the finest modern machinery money could buy. Leo, almost 8, worked at his own small bench, clumsily sanding a pine block, concentration mirroring his father's. His off-key humming was a constant welcome counterpoint to the lathe. This was the true jackpot. Peace. Money had been a tool, a means to an end. And the end was this life. Land, materials, freedom from worry, built by Henry's own hands. Arthur Vance's monthly update arrived. The fallout from the plaza had been a slow avalanche. Marcus Thorne, convicted of fraud and money laundering, now lived in a federal penitentiary, his empire dismantled and sold off to repay investors and the IRS. Eleanor fared no better. The SEC investigation exposed her complicity, leaving her unemployable. The divorce was swift and brutal. The documents she'd forced him to sign were thrown out as products of fraud and coercion. The hard drive evidence painted such calculated malice that the judge awarded Henry sole custody of Leo and left Eleanor with personal debt and a reputation so toxic she became a pariah. Vance mentioned, clinically, that she'd last been seen waitressing off an interstate, designer suits traded for stained polyester. Henry felt no surge of triumph, no sweet vindication, only quiet. He looked at his son's earnest shoulders and felt the grounding weight of a world set right. Balance restored not by rage but by an unyielding refusal to be erased. He hadn't destroyed her. He'd simply stepped aside and let her choices become the architects of her ruin. A week later, a piece of mail threatened that serenity. A flimsy off-white envelope, addressed in frantic, spidery scrawl he recognized instantly. No return address. A postmark from a transient town of cheap motels. The paper felt thin, insubstantial, and yet heavy with toxic gravity. He nearly fed it to the fire crackling in the massive stone hearth of his living room, the warm heart of the home he'd built. He wanted to watch it curl into ash before it could contaminate his peace. But the need for definitive closure stayed his hand. He sat in a worn leather armchair he'd reupholstered himself and slit the envelope open with his thumb. Inside, a single page torn from a cheap legal pad. The words were a torrent of recrimination and disbelief. No apology, no understanding. She didn't ask for money, not directly. She raged. She accused him of trapping her, hoarding his secret like a weapon, being as cruel and calculating as she was. At the bottom, one desperate question revealed everything. Why would you throw it all away for nothing? Henry read it again, and sorrowful clarity settled over him. She still didn't get it. She never would. To her, the apartment, career, status, money were everything. His craft, his quiet life, his devotion to his son were nothing. She understood only price. He'd built his world around value. He folded the letter and placed it gently into the fire. He watched the flames consume her final bitter words, and felt not anger or pity, but release. Across the room sat the finished rocking chair he'd been working on months ago, Leo's favorite spot to read. Henry had built it with love and patience. Its value wasn't the wood or the hours, but the joy it gave his son. The money had helped him protect that joy, but the joy itself, the quiet, unbuyable substance of a life well lived, was the true fortune. He had learned the difference between the price of everything and the value of one thing, and in that knowledge, he was the richest man in the world.